Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for bearing with us as we got all of the tech together here. I think we are good to go, and so really thrilled to kick off this panel and start this conversation, the first in our state power series. So I'm Gabby Goldstein. I'm co-founder here at Sister District, and I'm thrilled to be in partnership with my co-moderator, Shaniqua McClendon from Vote Save America and Crooked Media. And we're really thrilled to convene some really important and timely conversations about the importance of states, the growing importance of state legislatures and state power, and really have the space to think about how progressives can and how we can collectively build a positive vision of state power and really commit to building power at that level permanently. So just quickly, I know we're running a little bit behind. I'm going to share just a few brief thoughts about this series and why it's so timely and urgent, as well as this after row panel. I'll turn things over to Shaniqua to give us some intros of our panelists and some additional framing, and then we'll dive right in. I know that you're all as eager as I am to hear from Imani, Leah, and Erin in this moment. And at the end, we'll close with what you can do next, right? Some calls to action to join us at Vote Save America and Sister District, to learn, to really take action, to join arms, to join us, to build state power in this critical midterm year and beyond. So just a word of context about this series and this panel. The premise of this series, the State Power series, is that it's really time for all of us to learn more about the power of states and to challenge our thinking about states and state power and get excited about building progressive state power. We really see states and state legislatures as growing more important all the time. The most critical and life-altering policies, right? From abortion access to free and fair elections, the future of democracy itself, are increasingly coming not from our federal government, but from our often overlooked state governments and state legislatures. So we really have this need, this urgent need, existential need to explore and better understand state power and how we can all harness it and build towards it. So that's really the purpose here, is to start a conversation about the historical circumstances that have brought us to this moment of state ascendancy over civil rights, to understand this moment, what's happening, and eventually broaden our imagination and really commit to building progressive state power. So that brings us to this panel and after row. And when we planned this panel to kick off the series, we knew Dobbs was coming. We didn't know exactly when. We thought we might just be talking about the leaked draft. But here we are. And I know, for myself, and I'm sure some of you, despite all of the preparation that we did ahead of time, it's still been completely crushing. And in these moments, I think it can be really powerful to gather, to be together and be in community and to share our thoughts and strategize for the work ahead. And I just want to say also, I think it's important to frame this conversation to name the fact that, regardless of Dobbs, abortion access has never been universally guaranteed. And this, just, as with prior restrictions, will disproportionately impact low-income people, Black, Latino, Indigenous people, young LGBTQ plus folks and people in rural areas who will lack the resources disproportionately to cross the expanding abortion desert to seek care. And on the other hand, we have states like Colorado and California and Connecticut and Virginia that are going beyond the floor of abortion access and really kind of, exploring what reproductive justice could look like, creating the conditions under which folks can choose to parent or not have children, not have children, or parent with dignity in any case. So we'll explore some of that in the panel, and share together and strategize together. So with that, I'm really excited to dive in, and I'll turn things over to Shaniqua.
Thanks, Gabby. And thank you all for joining us today. As was mentioned, I won't go into this in too much detail, but we're here to kind of talk about building state power, especially in light of the Dobbs decision that was finally officially let out last week on Friday. And I just want to give a shout out to Sister District. A lot of people now are really excited about getting involved at the state level, but Sister District exists for that exact reason. And I'm from North Carolina, and right now, North Carolina is one of the few states in the South that at least, through the end of this year, we'll be able to leverage the fact that it has a Democratic governor and a state legislature where Republicans are not in the supermajority, so they're not able to overrule any vetoes if they get any ideas on passing any legislation around Roe or anything in the state. So thank you all to the work that you all do. And as always, it's great to be in partnership with you. And so just a little bit of housekeeping for those, well, I think everyone's watching on YouTube, actually. We have closed captioning that's available on YouTube. So really quickly, I'm just going to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to get started with the conversation. So first, we have Erin Ryan, who is a Daily Beast columnist. She's also host of Crooked Media's podcast, Hysteria, and a writer for It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, and she's based in sunny Los Angeles, as you can see. Next, we have Imani Gandy, who is a senior editor of law and policy for Rewired News Group, where she covers law in courts and co-hosts the R&G podcast, Boom Lawyered. Imani is a recovering attorney turned award-winning journalist and political blogger. She received her JD from the University of Virginia School of Law in 2001. And finally, we have Professor Leah Litman, who teaches and writes on constitutional law, federal courts, and federal sentencing at the University of Michigan. Her recent work appears in the California Law Review, Michigan Law Review, Virginia Law Review, Texas Law Review, Duke Law Journal, which I just can't not say Duke. I went to UNC. I don't know if I shared that with you yet. And then Northwestern Law Review. Her writing is for popular audiences and has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, Slate, and she's also a co-host of one of our other podcasts, another one of Crooked's podcasts, Strict Scrutiny. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Gabby to get us started with our first question.
Thank you, Shaniqua, and thank you to our panelists for taking some time to think with us, share your vision and your thoughts with us, and strategize together. So, just to get into Dobbs, Leah, I'm curious if you can share, give us some grounding in what's going on. Can you tell us a little bit about how we got here, the Mississippi law underlying the case, the reasoning in the decision? As I understand it, this is the first time in our history that the court has ever taken away a constitutional right. If there's anything significantly different from the leaked draft, and just what the main takeaways are from your perspective.
Sure. So the Mississippi law at issue in Dobbs prohibits abortions more than 15 weeks after a person's period, and it was passed in 2018. Now, if that year, right, it's during the Trump administration, it's after McConnell and Trump installed Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court after not allowing President Obama to confirm Merrick Garland to the court. And so Mississippi, thinks they have a better shot at, getting the Supreme Court to uphold a restrictive abortion law. And so they file, a case at the Supreme Court that asks the court to basically allow states greater latitude to restrict abortion. But what happens after they file the request to have the Supreme Court hear the case is Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passes away. And then, Trump and McConnell replace her with Justice Amy Coney Barrett. And the Supreme Court decides to take this case, and Mississippi, realizing the game has changed, now asks the Supreme Court, instead of giving states just greater latitude to restrict abortion, now asks the Supreme Court to just outright overrule Roe versus Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and effectively allow states to just ban abortion entirely. So they shift their argument strategy now that they have a different court, and it ultimately succeeds. For those of you who attended our last event when we discussed the draft leaked opinion, the final opinion is basically the draft with, a few paragraphs tacked on, just repeating the arguments and saying, the dissent and the concurrence don't have the better of the argument. But the basic bottom line of the opinion is the court says Roe and Casey are overruled. The Constitution contains no protection for the right to decide to have an abortion. And instead of the court's previous legal standard that had been used to decide whether abortion restrictions are constitutional or not, the court replaces it with basically the most lenient standard states could have. It asks whether, there's a rational basis for this law, basically whether states could drum up any hypothetical legitimate justification for the law. And the court emphasizes that states have a legitimate interest in the development of the fetus at all stages of development. And that line has led, states and commentators to think that, the court would allow states to ban abortion entirely. And the only question is whether under that standard, states would be required to offer exceptions for cases where abortion might be necessary to save the life or health of the pregnant person, as well as perhaps in cases of rape, incest, or trafficking. The Mississippi law contains no such exception, but because it only prohibits abortions more than 15 weeks after a person's last period, it's not a complete ban.
Thank you. Sorry, I thought I was on mute. Thank you, Leah. Erin, this next question is for you. I think a lot of people have said the decision was leaked. We knew it was coming, but when it came, it still just kind of, hit as fresh as it would have if we hadn't known. As you've been processing this and seeing others process it, what has been the response that you've seen? What's been your own response? And have you heard from people in your life, any listeners or readers or friends of yours about this decision?
Yeah, so that's a huge question. But I've found that, to start with, the responses that I've seen, they kind of fall into three categories. There's, I told you so. We've been saying this forever. And those are people who have been plugged into the reproductive justice space, journalists, writers, women of color, people working in the healthcare space. They're all like, we've been telling you for a very long time that this would happen. And then the second category is like, we can't believe it. I can't believe how bad it is. It's like they were blindsided. And then the third category is, I'm fine though. And like the third category is the one that really sticks in my craw, because it is like people who are living in blue states, people living in New York, California, not to pick on those two places. I've seen a lot of people trying to calm themselves down or downplay the severity of this ruling by pointing out the fact that reproductive harm is what's happening to other people elsewhere, rather than the immediacy of what this ruling means. My reaction was, we saw this coming. People like you and I saw this coming for a very long time. I felt a little bit like a Cassandra, in 2018 when Kennedy announced that he was stepping down from the Supreme Court. The writing was kind of on the wall to anybody who's in this space. And I felt very fatigued from being told over and over again that pointing out that Roe was on the way out, I was labeled hysterical or overreacting, or you're being too emotional. There are all these bad legal takes coming out. Leah, I think that you highlighted some of them, of people being like, oh, Kavanaugh and Gorsuch are fine. There's a huge I told you so feeling to it for me. But also, when the ruling came out, there was a feeling to me, as a mother, I have an 8-month-old. I can't imagine living in a country that forces people to go through pregnancy and childbirth. That is unbelievably inhumane. And even though I have been, since, I started working in journalism, I've been dealing with these questions of bodily autonomy in the US. Every time I approach this topic, I'm reminded again of how ruthless and inhumane it is for a country, for anybody in a country, to seriously think that it should be okay for anybody to be forced to be pregnant, to give birth. It's really disgusting to me as a human being. As a journalist, writer, person in this space, it's something that was expected, but it's still horrifying.
Yeah, no, completely agree. I, when I was working out when the news broke, and I just stopped working out and I just started crying, even though I knew it was coming. But it just hits you really hard. Imani, this next question is for you. The reproductive rights framework focuses on the legal right to abortion, but the reproductive justice framework is more expansive. Can you break that down for us a bit and explain why in this moment we need to really be focused on a justice framework and how we can build toward that at the state level?
Sure. So, I think it's pretty safe to say that the movement has failed, and that going forward, we need to build a better movement. We need to build a more inclusive movement, and we need to build a movement that focuses on the most marginalized among us, and a movement that is led by those people, right? I think up until now, we've seen a lot of movement work being led at the national level by mainstream repro organizations to the exclusion of the people who are actually affected on the ground. For example, to the exclusion of people in Mississippi who were affected on the ground in 2010 when there was a personhood ballot initiative, and grassroots activists, Black women on the ground, were saying, okay, but there's a personhood ballot initiative, but there's also this voter ID initiative, and they're connected, and we need you to see that. And they wouldn't see that. And I think that's, part of the reason that we are where we are is because of the chasm between Black feminism and white feminism. And I think it's been amazing over the last decade that I've been in this space. I would say over the last 5 years, I've seen that chasm narrow. And so I think it's safe to say that the dominant movement has failed, and it's time to move. The rights movement framework has failed, and to move on to a justice framework would mean that you have the right to terminate a pregnancy, you have the right to have children, and then you also have the right to raise the children that you have in a healthy and safe environment. And it's that third prong that really forms this umbrella that encompasses so many other social justice movements that, to be quite honest, we could just call everything that progressives, liberals, socialists, anyone on the left, we could call everything we care about reproductive justice. It's environmental justice. How are Black and brown people supposed to raise their kids when there's dumping of chemicals in neighborhoods? There's environmental racism. It's housing justice. How are unhoused people supposed to raise their kids? It's when a case comes out about school prayer, how is it that, someone who does not adhere to the dominant faith is supposed to send their kid to this public school when they don't have any other options? So I think moving forward, this justice framework really does sort of hone in on those aspects of reproductive freedom that are being destroyed, specifically targeting Black and brown people, trans people. We have to remember that abortion is not only a service that women require, trans and non-binary people require it as well. In terms of how do we bring that to the states, I think that really requires listening to people on the ground, listening to people in communities, because people in various communities know how to talk to each other about abortion, which is apparently such a sticky subject that it took Joe Biden until after Roe was decimated before he could finally even say it. So I think that, when people sort of parachute into communities and take over and talk over, I think that does a disservice to the movement writ large, because people need to feel like they have power. They need to feel like they have a voice in what they are trying to do in their own communities. And excuse me if you heard my dog, she's a little bit hyper right now.
Imani, thank you so much for that. I think that speaks to, the idea that progressives have really in my view, over-invested in federal strategies, federal power building, and had really long-term disinvestment in states. And thank you for calling out Mississippi. I just want to give a shout out to, folks like Lori Bertram Roberts, right, who I know as well, who's been on the ground in Mississippi doing this work for, without any funding, without any, accolades and all the rest for decades, right? And so what it means is to invest in the folks on the ground in real state power building, right? And not just invest and overinvest, in my view, in federal, not just institutions, but strategies and policies and all the rest. So I really appreciate that. Leah, curious to go back to Dobbs for a minute and think about, the Thomas concurrence and, the idea that the Supreme Court should reconsider all, not just some, but all of the court's substantive due process precedents. So, that would include contraception, access, same-sex relationships, same-sex marriage. Can you tell us a little bit about this, the way that this case affects the right to liberty, and if you see this as sort of a dark portend for additional rights?
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with something that Erin said, which is, seeing Roe overruled was in a lot of ways for some people an I told you so moment. There were people saying there was no chance Roe was going to go anywhere. Senator Ben Sasse has said at the confirmation hearings for the justices nominated by Donald Trump that, we've seen women in pink pussy hats being hysterical at all of these hearings, always saying Roe is overruled, it never happens. And then it happens because we were right all along. And the same thing is happening now when people raise concerns that the court might come for other rights as well, like the right to marriage equality, the right to contraception, or the right to same-sex sexual intimacy. And the reason why that is because the reasoning that the court used in Dobbs to overrule Roe and undercut the right to an abortion can be transplanted into a decision undercutting and overruling other rights as well. The court said we overrule Roe. It has no basis in the Constitution because it's not specifically mentioned in the constitutional text. It's not deeply rooted in history and tradition because there aren't, 17th, 18th, 19th century decisions of courts, legislative enactments, or law review articles that say there's a right to an abortion. That's an extremely limited and restricted understanding of how to identify rights. And you can, again, apply that reasoning to the right to contraception. It's not mentioned in the Constitution's text. It's not deeply rooted in history and tradition because there aren't decisions from the 1800s that say, women have a right to contraception because at the time, women weren't recognized as legal persons. They couldn't vote. You can apply the same reasoning to marriage equality or the ability to have, consensual sexual relationship with a person of the same sex, not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, not deeply rooted in history and tradition, because there aren't cases from the 1800s that say those things are rights. So by its own logic, the reasoning in Dobbs would seem to undercut all of those other decisions as well. And so what the majority opinion in Dobbs does is just like wave its hands and say, trust us, none of those other rights are at issue. We know how far that got us when all of the justices appeared before the Senate in their confirmation hearings and said, Roe is settled precedent. I'm not sure, why we would be fooled again. But even beyond that, one of the kind of bases that the justices use to say, well, it's only Roe, it's none of these other rights, is they just say, well, abortion is fundamentally different because it involves a potential life. First, it's not clear if that would actually distinguish abortion from certain forms of contraception. Some states and some justices on the court believe that certain forms of contraception are really just methods of abortion. And second is what that suggests is none of the court's reasoning was actually guiding its decision. That is, they don't really care whether it's rooted in text. They don't really care whether it's rooted in history. What they care about is whether they believe or support the values underlying those rights. And if that's the business that they're in, then we should all be scared about rights to marriage equality, rights to contraception, and more. And we're already seeing, just in the last 4 to 5 days, Republican politicians beginning to call for some of those other decisions to be overruled. The Attorney General of Texas said, if it were up to him, the court would overrule Lawrence versus Texas. That's the decision that said states can't throw gay people in jail for having sex. The governor of Utah said, if it were up to me, I think we should overrule Obergefell versus Hodges. That's the decision that said states can't deny marriage licenses to couples of the same sex. So already in the 4 days after Dobbs, we're seeing increased interest in the court overruling the decisions that it just undercut the theoretical and doctrinal basis for in the opinion in Dobbs. So I think there are lots of reasons to worry, in part because all of the people telling us not to worry now were the people telling us not to worry about Roe for the last 5 years, 10 years, and more.
Yeah. And, I wouldn't say the media told us not to worry, but they definitely didn't tell us to worry. Something before the Dobbs decision was leaked, something that I was starting to hear a lot about, which was shocking to me, was the believability gap that Roe would actually be overturned. I guess if you work in politics, you know I guess you're a little bit more aware of what's going on. But, I actually spoke to a friend who, after the decision was leaked, was like, I just did not think this was going to happen. And so this next question is for both Erin and Imani, and we can start with Erin. What role do you think the media plays in communicating the implications of the Dobbs decision to the public? And have they, and are they now meeting the moment on that?
Oh, that's another great question. So here's the thing about the way that the media covers abortion, contraception, issues of reproductive justice. I have been irked for so long about how little people whose beats seem to be abortion, contraception, and the way that they intersect with politics, how little they seem to understand about what each thing means. And here's an example. Plan B. Not abortion. Plan B is contraception. And in so much media coverage, including by the AP, I have seen the two conflated. And I think that's like a deliberate conflation on the part of the far right, who now want to very slowly bring in contraception under the title of abortifacient, which Professor Litman implied. I think that we have to be very diligent about the way that the media characterizes different aspects of reproductive health care. And we need to be kind of nitpicky about weighing in when we see media people conflating things that shouldn't be conflated, getting facts wrong. Leah, you said something about 15 weeks after a person's period. I think a lot of people don't understand like how pregnancy is calculated. It's from day one of the period, not from day one of conception. And that's this, very confusing aspect of gynecology that I don't know why they still do it that way. But the way that Texas's 6-week ban was reported, for example, implied that a person would have 6 weeks after they found out they were pregnant to make the decision. I saw some really good coverage clarifying that usually six weeks pregnancy is about 2 weeks after you could possibly know that you were pregnant. I think that sort of clarity is really, really important. I've seen it succeed in some places. I've seen it fail in others. And to go back to something Imani said about plugging into communities when it comes to paying attention to what individual communities need, I think something that is a real shame right now at this moment, as the states are more powerful than they've ever been when it comes to determining reproductive rights, we're also at a point where local media is more deprived and stripped clean than it's ever been. And so I think local media and state media have a bigger responsibility than they ever have before to accurately convey what's happening at the state level. So if you're a news consumer, what you can do is make sure that you have a subscription to your best local newspaper and a subscription to get past the paywall, or like a secret link where you can get past the paywall of your state capital's reporting, like whatever the best reporting coming from your state capital is, you should plug into that, because that's the best way to keep track of things on a local level. I think that the national media tries to make things into national stories all the time. And the best way to know what's really going on with people is to plug into states and communities and your community. So I guess this is like, I guess I gave you a two-pronged answer. On one hand, I think the media does a 50-50 job of getting things actually accurate when they're talking about this like world of medicine that some people still do not understand and that's deliberately conflated as a means to an end. But also as news consumers, I think that focusing less on national cable news and chyrons and splashy headlines and the feeling of participating on social media in some kind of like CNN manufactured moment. I think turning away from that and focusing instead on your local news sources and community is really, really important right now as media consumers.
Yeah. Imani. I can repeat the question if that's helpful. Go ahead.
Yeah, if you could. I got a little bit of the ADD.
Yeah, just wondering if you have any thoughts on the role the media should play in communicating the implications of Dobbs to the public, the Dobbs decision to the public, and are they meeting the moment of that?
I think, as a legal journalist, I have been frustrated with the coverage of Dobbs insofar as it seems to me that there was sort of the believability gap that you talked about. I feel like the media also suffered from that, to the extent that we were getting op-eds in papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, trying to soften the blow of what was coming by saying things like, well, if the court upholds this 15-week ban, it's not going to be that bad. And that's because that's kind of close to when quickening was. And that was originally the standard in the 19th and 18th and 19th centuries. I got frustrated at the sort of unwillingness to grapple with the actual legal issues and in favor of an effort to almost placate the population about what was coming. So I found that to be extremely frustrating. And I have to and what Erin was saying. I mean, the fact that there aren't follow-up questions being asked of people who are spouting clear nonsense in the media is really frustrating to me. Like when you have a candidate for office in Virginia saying that, I don't know, maybe because if you're raped, it happens so quickly and it's by force, that I don't know, maybe the body has a way of shutting that thing down. I mean, we saw a rebirth of Todd Aikinism, or you have these legislators who somehow seem to believe that you can re-implant ectopic pregnancies into the womb. I mean, that's absurd. That's a medical impossibility. And over the past couple of days, I've been seeing screenshots being passed around on social media of people who are clearly, quote unquote, pro-life or certainly anti-abortion, who don't even know what an abortion is. They don't know that a miscarriage is a spontaneous abortion. And so you see people who are in the know, nurse practitioners, doctors, providers, trying to tell people, if you have an ectopic pregnancy, you need an abortion. And that's the medicine for an ectopic pregnancy, right? Abortion is medicine. And I'm seeing people in response getting angry about these facts because they didn't understand that now their daughter's life may be at risk if she has an ectopic pregnancy, that if there's a miscarriage, you may find yourself on the business end of the carceral system, because now every miscarriage is a crime scene. People don't know the ramifications of what has just happened. And that's partly because the media hasn't told them.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for being able, Imani, just giving all that detail, because it is what's missing. And we're really fortunate to have you all here to share in this conversation. Erin, my next question is for you. You recently wrote a piece in the Daily Beast suggesting deputized people should file suit against environmental polluters who knowingly introduce chemicals into the environment that endanger pregnancies or fertility. Could you talk more about kind of what you were getting at with that in response to some of the anti-abortion bounty laws that have been passed throughout the country? And if anyone else wants to jump in, feel free as well.
Sure. So I am not a lawyer yet. So this is just me kind of Jonathan Swifting, which is, making a kind of somewhat ridiculous argument, but then again, the Texas law is inherently ridiculous. So here's the thing. There's this like George Carlin joke that has been circulating a lot lately, where it's like they only care about babies until they're born. After they're born, fuck them, essentially, right? Sorry, I don't know if I was allowed to say the F word, but sorry. But the reality is, if you look further into what conservatives do and the way that the Supreme Court specifically has acted, actually, they don't really care about the unborn either. Because one of the main things that can harm unborn babies, fetuses, embryos, human beings at any stage of development, and pregnant people, pollution, toxicity in the environment. There are things that companies are allowed to dispose of, as Imani mentioned before, predominantly in neighborhoods where people of color live, or in places where marginalized people live, or in places where poor people live, that have known links to birth defects, infertility, bad maternal outcomes. Why are those things on the table for us to file suit against? Why can't we sue Monsanto for using a specific type of pesticide on a field with the knowledge that there are women of fertile age living in a 30-mile radius. Why can't families in California living in hyper-polluted cities sue? Under a law like that, why can't anybody living in hyper-polluted environments sue polluters saying that that pollution caused a miscarriage, infertility, or some sort of birth defect? Because there are clear scientific links between things that are dumped into the environment and bad outcomes. I think that that's something that we should try to do. Look, I mentioned the Sun Pod Save America this week, but people on the anti-abortion side try crazy laws over and over again until they actually get enacted. I believe Imani mentioned that in 2010, Mississippi attempted a personhood amendment to their state constitution, and it failed. And I remember in 2010, everyone thinking, this is insane. I can't believe they're trying this. This is insane. Well, it's not that insane anymore. It's something that we could actually see being enacted. I think that we should just match them. Let's just be exactly as insane as they are and say, okay, you're dumping stuff into this neighborhood where women of reproductive age, where people of reproductive age live. All right, cool. I'm suing you for the fact that you could be causing harm. I also think that, I think that there is nothing wrong with a little bit of deliberate, like I am Spartacusing, gumming up the courts when it comes to ridiculous laws like this. And if we can make it as big a pain in the butt as possible, I think we should. I think here's the thing. I know that a lot of people don't have the money to just file tons of lawsuits against polluters, but I've seen a lot of celebrities and influencers and people with a lot of money speaking out against the Texas law on social media. And all I'm saying is, if you are a multi-millionaire and you've got the time to make a video about how this SB 8 is bad, maybe you've got the money to file a few lawsuits. Maybe you've got the money to cause a little bit of problems for people that are making these laws who think there'll be no consequences for them. I think people can put their money where their mouth is in a more creative way. And that was sort of the argument behind what I'm saying. Anything that is done that harms fetuses, embryonic development, pregnant people, babies, I think we should treat that as deliberately harmful actions that should be subject to the same laws that abortion would be.
Yes, because if it's really about the kids.
If it's really about the kids, then let's protect the kids. Let's do it. Let's clean up the water. Let's clean up the air. Let's protect the kids.
I love the creativity, and I also love the inclination to go on offense, right? Which I think animates some of that strategy, right? Is that we shouldn't always be playing defense. We should find ways to play offense. And I think it's also connected a bit to this next question, which is for the lawyers of the panel, but it really. I'd love to flip the conversation for a second and talk about the positive power of states in this moment. And, going back to the idea of going on offense, but I'd love to think a little bit about the extent to which we can make some room for state power in this fight, in this moment. And going back to what Imani said around bringing reproductive justice to the states, what would that mean? It would mean empowering folks on the ground who are doing that year-round power building work, often led by Black folks, people of color, and this long-term disinvestment in state power building, this overinvestment in federal power building. We have to do both. And, especially for the lawyers on the panel, I really think that Heather Gerken, who's the dean of the Yale Law School, is just incredibly insightful and brilliant. And something that an observation that she's had is that federalism has no partisan valence. Right? As a concept, federalism is neutral. It's just that one party has used it as a political tool and one party hasn't. And so, I think one way to build towards conceptualize the positive power of states is to celebrate, some of the work that is being done in some of our states around abortion access and repro, and really envision, blow that out and envision states as venues for expansive and transformative policy. And so we have examples of that, right? We have Connecticut and Colorado. I'm here in California, where I just saw yesterday that the budget that's been proposed includes $205 million in new expenditures for reproductive rights. And so I'm curious for your thoughts, how can we think of what these states are doing, the positive power of states? How can we shift our strategy and our thinking to make room for state power and look to these states as blueprints for that? Imani, you're muted.
I am muted. I've been lately sort of banging on about how important state court judges are and how important state court judge elections are. That is an area that a lot of people on the Democratic, the leftish side don't focus on. And, there are some states where people can elect their judges. And quite frankly, it's difficult to find information on those judges. I mean, they don't make it easy. And I think maybe that's intentional because of, stagnant sort of thinking or what have you. But the way forward, I think, for reproductive justice, particularly with respect to litigation, is for things to happen like when the Utah judge issues an injunction and allows abortions to go forward just even for 2 more weeks. Or, the same thing happened in Texas. I think Louisiana, a similar thing happened. These fights are going to be playing out in state court because the federal courts are screwed, quite frankly. They have been Trumpified. I think it's 1 in 4 federal court judges are Trump judges, and we have Trump judges doing truly wild things. So, and when it comes to building state power, and I think when it comes to building sort of grassroots power, I think it's important for people to start focusing more on who is judging, who is overseeing their cases, who is adjudicating this litigation when it comes to bounty hunter laws like SB 8, or when it comes to, for example, when you're electing district attorneys, these are the district attorneys that may decide, no, I'm not going to prosecute providers and patients under these, these ruthless, as Erin said, laws. So I think there's a lot of space for power to be built, and power to be built in a way that will sort of get away from the negativity, I think, that a lot of people are feeling with respect to Congress. I think there's a lot of negativity with respect to Congress, rightfully so. And I think a way for voters, for just regular people to empower themselves is to start taking a stronger hand in who they are electing as judges.
So I would just say this, which is I would love for Democrats and progressives to be able to go on offense. You're right to point out that some of the Democratic controlled states have enacted exciting initiatives, insulating providers from legal liability, for performing abortions for people coming from out of state or reproductive deserts. Some have also enacted initiatives, supporting more public access and public support for abortion. And those are all really good things. The only way we can get to a world in which there are judges that are willing to endorse or embrace Erin's exciting theories for, Democratic-led or Democratic-style Texas SB 8 laws is to win and obtain political power. Like, that is why the crazy Republican theories are winning in the courts right now, because Republicans won elections. They won elections by finding every single lever of political power there was. That includes at the state and local level. By winning control of state legislatures, they were in a position to draw districts to give themselves even more power at the state and local level, as well as at the federal level. That then gave them more power to appoint judges to endorse all of their fun pet legal theories. And if we want to have a good time, we need to win. But in order to win, and in order to get a sustainable victory, we need to do it at the state and local level. I am all about the wonderful philanthropy that a lot of progressives, celebrities want to support. I wish, however, they would take some of the money that is going toward organizations that frankly are having to substitute in for states and governments right now that aren't offering basic services, and put some of that money to winning political power so that we can use the state to actually provide the services and support that it should be providing. And again, so that we can actually build a movement that is sustainable. So I would love for more Democrats and more progressives to be able to go on offense. But in order for us to get there, we need to do the little things to win elections and build sustainable power now and over the long term.
At the state level, I can't thank you enough for that, Leah. You know, something I always run the numbers when the FEC filings come out. And just in the first part of 2022, like up till the end of Q1, I ran the numbers, and Democrats running in non-competitive Senate races raised almost $120 million just by the end of
that
April.
Money is going down the toilet.
I'm saying in non-competitive Senate races, 120 million. Whereas, for perspective, in 2020, when Democrats were just 4 seats shy of flipping the Arizona state legislature, they raised less than $10 million for the entire cycle. And just till the end of Q1, non-competitive Democrats in non-competitive Senate seats, $120 million. It is, again, that overinvestment in federal, and severe underinvestment in state legislatures and state power building. So I completely, that resonates very, very deeply. And, you know, I know we're almost at time, but I did want to ask one last question, which is kind of to sort of bring it all back and also back in, you know, this moment, and I know, we've all said this in different ways on this panel, this moment didn't come out of nowhere, right? As Erin said, for folks who have been following this, and all the rest, we knew this was coming. Conservatives have really been building towards this moment around Dobbs and so much else for many, many decades, right? And this idea that there is this conservative jurisprudential goal of narrowing federal civil rights protections and reverting those back to states. And I was just reading Michael Waldman from the Brennan Center. He has like a periodic newsletter by email, highly recommended. It's really great. And he was talking about the fact that this originalism in the court's ruling on abortion and guns and so forth is pretty new, right? And it really is a reaction to conservative reaction to the rights revolution of the 60s and 70s. And I'm curious, especially for the lawyers on the line, but also just sort of in general, for Erin as well. Does this signal to you that, that we're kind of at the death of the rights revolution? And in that moment, what should we be doing? Again, this is another call to arms back to states to counter this and build towards the freedom and justice model that we want in our states. Death of the rights revolution?
I think there's a death of the rights revolution. I think there's a shift in how that revolution is being fought, right? I think that there's more equity when it comes to liberatory movements for Black and brown folks, Indigenous folks, and low-income white folks. I feel like reproductive justice, for example, is the sort of shifting of the rights movement that we are looking at. And I think it's powerful. The one question that people keep asking me is, how do I feel? And I quite frankly feel relieved that this part is over, because I'm looking forward to the next chapter. I'm looking forward to building something that is stronger than Roe, that doesn't rely on a right that half the country believes doesn't exist anyway, this idea of substantive due process rights. I mean, conservatives don't think they exist. I think the right to abortion should be grounded in equal protection, should be grounded in human rights. It should be grounded in natural rights. And so I'm looking forward to building something better. So no, I don't think the rights movement is over. I think it's changing, and I think it's changing for the better.
I mean, I just say we are in the counter-revolution stage of the conservative legal movement and the Republican Party, and where Democrats and progressives find themselves is where conservatives and Republicans felt like they were in the 1950s and 1960s during the Warren Court era. And what they did during that era, were several different things, but one through line was figuring out all of the levers of political power, winning them and exercising them to the maximum extent possible. Now, of course, there were other things happening simultaneously, the development of the Federalist Society and the conservative legal movement, and a network of, conservative think tanks and public interest organizations to support their work intellectually, and give them, more legitimacy, in kind of the public sphere and elsewhere. So there are many, many, many different ways you can get involved in, building what Imani described as something better and something new. But I think it's important to understand that takes a really long time horizon. And in order for it to be successful, again, it requires obtaining and securing political power. It just can't be done all through civil society and private organizations.
Can I just weigh in like super quick? I think that I agree with Leah and Imani, but I wanted to add that I think a big piece of this is there is a sort of economic hopelessness among people under a certain age, and a lack of access to things that their parents had, and even their like older siblings had. I think that until we get to a point where older millennials and younger feel like they have access to basics that their parents just took for granted, home ownership, the ability to have more than one child without bankrupting themselves, the ability to save and pay for their college, their education, their childcare. Like there are all of these things that previous generations had that we just like don't, it's gone for us. And until something has shifted to enable younger people or people who maybe don't have generational wealth to establish any sort of foothold economically, I think that there's going to be an inability for the disenfranchised generation to really put their back into it and care. And I don't want to sound cynical, but I really think that is like a huge missing piece. Like federal student loan forgiveness would have been huge. Medical debt forgiveness would be huge. There's all of these debts and financial things weighing on people under, say, 45, that make it really hard for us to focus on rights when people are just focusing on survival.
Yeah. And unfortunately, by getting rid of access to abortion, that's just kind of compounded if people are forced to have children that they either don't want or can't afford. And it does make it that much harder to participate in our society from an economic standpoint. So, not the brightest note to end on, but I think we all knew we were coming into this conversation to have a really tough conversation and just start to understand what we could do as next steps as this decision is finally official and states are taking different actions to either provide and strengthen access to abortion or unfortunately take it completely away. But the bright side, if we can find one, as Imani said, is like we can get on to the next phase of this. The gut punch has come and now we can move on to what we can do. And so we hope that you'll continue to join us for these conversations. But one of the things that we hope you all will do is join us in the calls to action that we have for you coming out of this conversation. And so one of the things that you can do is visit votesaveamerica.com/row. And there you'll find we have multiple fundraising opportunities. And, Leah, thank you so much for pointing out that it is very important that we fund immediate access to abortion services that people need. But in the absence, those are just kind of filling a gap for what we actually need. And we need to build power so that we can actually change these laws. So it's not up to generosity of strangers to provide something that should be a right, but that the government is able to do what it's actually supposed to do and provide for its citizens. So I'm going to pass it over to Gabby to close this out.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that what comes through here is exactly that. I mean, we're in a new phase, and it's a great opportunity for us to all engage in state power building. And, we've heard so much about, the ways in which that has been traditionally anemic on our side, the structures of state power that the right has been building for so long. It is our time. And on the positive side, it's not just that we're fighting against the terrible things that Republicans are doing in our states, we're fighting for as well. And, we talked about some of the incredible work that some of our blue states are doing around repro. So I would encourage everyone to join us at Sister District. As Shaniqua said, we've been doing this for a while. Our entire mission is to build progressive power in state legislatures. And we've got national phone banks rolling for our 18 endorsed state leg candidates in some of the biggest battleground states this year, states that will determine the future of our democracy, Michigan, Pennsylvania, et cetera, states that now have trigger laws that have been triggered at banning abortion, including in Arizona and Michigan and so forth. And so please join us. We're running weekly national phone banks. You can go to sisterdistrict.com and sign up, join us, join arms, and make room for state power building. It's not that we have to stop working on federal power building, but just let's add state power building as a permanent part of what we do to build power in this country. So, and please do join us for our next events in the series as well. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us and for sharing their insights with us. I feel stronger for it and ready indeed for the next phase. Thanks so much. Have a great night.
Thanks, you too.
Awesome.